Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the Future of Cooling program for COP26. Today, we will be focusing on social interactions and cooling cultures. My name is Antonella Mazzone, and I'm a research associate at Oxford Martin School's Future Cooling program. And in my role, I investigate the influence of culture and society in shaping cooling needs. With global rising temperatures, space cooling is expected to become an indispensable service for health and well-being for most of the world's population by 2050. Understandably, this invokes a techno-economic perspective, but there is a bigger picture behind cooling needs. Society has an undeniable influence on our experience of cooling, whether that's through cultural practice, policies, or other factors. Cooling needs are shaped by agents of change, networks of people who have retained unique abilities and often power to shape the building environment and lifestyles. Studies show that the need for cooling is rooted in ideas of modernity, which are reproduced through institutions, influencing groups and social relations. Other studies instead point out that sweating and its meaning, which signifies specific meanings of and message of class belonging, gender, and stereotypes. Helping us navigate through these social cultural insights, today there will be Janet Stephenson, a research professor and director at the Centre for Sustainability at the University of Otago in New Zealand. She has a background in sociology, planning, and human geography, and she's currently investigating the interconnections between people and their local environments, and the role of individuals and organizations in the transition to a sustainable future. Janet has published an extensive body of work on energy cultures, and today she will be discussing how cultural framing help us appreciate the interlocking of technologies, behaviors, expectations, both in home situations and at home. Our second speaker is Russell Hitchings. He's an associate professor of human geography at University College London. His research examines different aspects of everyday life that may be changing in ways that have important implications for social well-being and environmental sustainability. His project in Australian and Singaporean academics on thermal modernity and air conditioning in Qatar developed his interest in how thermal comfort and the energy demand associated with this idea can be examined through a cultural lens. At the end of Janet and Russell's presentation, please post your question to the Ask a Question button you can find at the end, bottom right-hand side on the screen. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Stephenson. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonella, and thank you very much to the Future of Cooling program for inviting me to contribute to this series. Now, I'll have to start by admitting that I'm not really a specialist in cooling at all, but for the last 11 years, I have been doing research on energy systems using a cultural perspective. What I can offer you tonight is a few insights from work by my teams and others on energy cultures and how this lens can help reveal why cooling, as with other ways we use energy, is so much more than just a technical process, and what this means for policy. I don't need to tell you that climate change will bring hotter and more extended hot periods with serious implications for human health and well-being, such as excess morbidity and mortality, reduced productivity and heat stress, affecting people in households, workplaces, and institutions. How these groups of people respond to the new challenges will be shaped by their attitudes, beliefs, knowledge, and behaviours that they already have, as well as by the way that their buildings are constructed and the appliances that they have. That is, by their current energy culture, or in this case, their cooling culture. To understand what I mean by this, let's look at the core elements of culture in a generic sense to start with. Firstly, culture is about ways of thinking, how people make sense of, give meaning to, and evaluate their world. This includes their beliefs, values, and norms, their expectations and aspirations about how life should be lived. Secondly, it's about what people do and how they do it. This includes everyday routines and habits, as well as actions or activities they might do rarely, but that are still socially influenced. Thirdly, things that people make, things they acquire, and things that they have and use. This includes both physical things like houses and appliances and non-physical things like software. And finally, it includes the distinctive ways that culture is mediated and expressed through knowledge, skills, and forms of language. Simplifying this even further, we often use this stripped down framework to represent the energy culture of any actor or group of actors. Basically, it's about the interconnections between what people have, their materiality, what they think, their norms, and what they do, their practices. We call this the cultures framework. We're most often interested in how the interactions between these elements give rise to particular outcomes. These outcomes could be to do with health and well-being, or energy use, or any social, economic, or environmental effect. And across any given population, we can identify clusters of households or businesses with roughly similar energy cultures that are associated with particular outcomes. So let's look at what this might mean in relation to cooling. Here's an example of the cooling culture of people who've got really well-insulated homes. They've got good cooling technologies. They've got a heating norm of about 23 degrees being cool enough for them, which they can make happen through use of their air conditioning unit. They've probably got really great well-being outcomes, but as the climate heats up, this will become increasingly expensive for them and likely put stress on the electricity grid. Here's another cooling culture. These people have poor quality, uninsulated homes. Maybe they have a fan, but they probably pour water on their head when needed, and 30 degrees it may be considered a normal temperature inside. They may already be suffering heat stress, but have little capacity to do anything about it. As the climate heats up, the health outcomes may well worsen, although they'll have minimal impact on the electricity grid. These cultures are about to undergo change from forces beyond their control. There are already many influences on people's cooling cultures. These are things that we can't control, but shape how we think and act and what we choose to acquire, or what we can afford to acquire. Obvious ones would be energy prices and relevant policies such as insulation subsidies. But climate change brings new external influences like rising temperatures and urban heat island effects. If people don't have the capacity to adjust their cooling cultures, what they do, what they have, their expectations of coolness, they're likely to suffer health and well-being impacts. Yet if they do start to change, those changes may well have unexpected outcomes. Let's have a look at some of those cultural dynamics. The standard response to increasing temperatures, if you can afford it, is to invest in cooling technologies. But the outcomes are rarely as straightforward as we might hope because cultural dynamics get in the way. I'm going to use a couple of examples that are completely hypothetical, but they are based on findings from our research relating to energy cultures more generally. So firstly, changes to one aspect of culture very frequently leads to change in other aspects, and we've observed this across many fields. In this example, with the greater uptake of air conditioning technologies, people have, maybe for the first time, some personal control over how cool their indoor temperatures are. This can lead to a change in norms. So where coolness was previously considered to be 25 degrees, it may well creep downwards to, say, 18 degrees. They end up paying a lot more than they did before. This particular unintended consequence is often called the rebound effect, where it's referring to the increase in energy consumption. But a cultural perspective helps you see that this happens because aspects of culture are interlinked. But change doesn't always alter energy cultures. For example, if new material solutions don't have a good fit with existing culture, their intended benefits may well fail. This has been well shown in a number of examples with social housing retrofits not achieving the efficiency gains that were hoped. This is because people didn't have the norms, the skills, or the ability to change their practices that were needed to make these physical changes effective. For cooling interventions, this could mean that the modelled cooling outcomes are not achieved. So any proposed material intervention has to consider the cultural implications. And we can see consequential changes in other aspects of culture as well. An example that I frequently see in workplaces is how business practice is to set air conditioning temperatures very low in summer, much lower than they would be set in winter. We could well see more of this as outdoor temperatures rise. Low indoor temperatures become the expected norm, and people accordingly adjust their material response with cool weather clothing, despite the exterior reality. This has consequences both for energy consumption and for norms around coolness that people may well transfer back to their home situation. So how does this set of ideas help us think about policy? A changing climate means that people will make their own cooling cultural changes within their capacity to act. But sometimes this will lead to poor outcomes for those families or organisations or for wider energy systems. These are the areas where we might want to focus our policy.
Janet, excuse me, we have an issue. I might interrupt you, sorry about that. We can't see your slides. I'm very sorry. We're receiving a lot of messages in the chat that we can't see your slides.
No!
Yes, sorry about that.
Oh my God, this is terrible. I'm so sorry, everybody.
Technology, it happens. No problem at all.
How do I? That's really awful.
No problem at all. No problem at all.
Sorry about this, you guys. Let me try and do this again.
Please take your time. Please, the public, bear with us a little bit while we adjust this small technical issue.
Let's try this one. Can you see that? Sorry, are you seeing
yes.
full slides?
Yes. Oh, good. You are. Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I need to think about whether I backstep a little bit. How am I going for time?
Yeah, you have plenty. No problems.
I have plenty. Oh, I'm sorry, you guys.
No problem at all.
I'm just wondering whether I quickly go back to some key slides, because there are some absolutely critical points I want you to just pick up here. And one of those, I guess, let's start here around external influences, I think. Now let me just see if I can find that one again. Select window or screen, PowerPoint show. There we go. Right. Okay. What a pity. Okay, cultural dynamics. Okay, so what I'm talking about here is how changes to one aspect of culture frequently leads to changes in others. And I've already talked about this, but I just wanted you to see how I show it visually in terms of the flow on impact of one change to others. And this is where I was talking about the Jevons paradox, or the rebound effect. And also issue times when there are technological solutions brought about, but they don't necessarily take on if they've got a poor fit with the particular culture. And I use the example here of social housing retrofits for greater energy efficiency, not always being successful. And then I was talking about how a lot of businesses super cool their premises, and this drives changes in what is considered normal, so people's normative appreciation of temperature, and drives changes in materiality and sets off an understanding in people of what is a normal expectation of coolness, or I think Russell uses the wonderful word coolth from memory. So I'm now really interested in what this means for policy. So firstly, as I said, we need to find out what are the different cooling cultures already in our society. What complexes of norms, knowledge, skills, practices, and materiality enable people to keep cool? And what solutions can policy learn from this? So how can policy actually learn from its own citizens in ways that we can keep cool using quite different approaches? And what can culture groups learn from each other that can help us all traverse this hotter future? We need to also think about how easy it is for people to change their cooling culture in response to rising global temperatures. For some, the external influences are less constraining on change. They can easily escape the city in summer. The more costly energy bills aren't really an issue to them, or they can easily take advantage of policies set up to help. For others, the capacity to act may be highly constrained. This may be because their norms, practices, or materiality relating to other aspects of their lives are very, very hard to alter. And it could be because they don't have the freedom or capacity to respond to external influences as the former group did. They can't get out of town. They can't take advantage of supportive policies, and they find energy prices crippling. So these influences are even more constraining on adjustments they can make to remain cool. Culture can also work on multiple levels. For example, simply being within rental accommodation can strongly constrain your ability to act. This work by one of my postgraduate students looked at how the energy cultures of landlords had significant constraints on the ability of tenants to keep warm. Landlords, of course, control much of the material lives of their tenants, but also landlords' norms, practices, and knowledge influence their tenants' ability to make changes alone. Tenants did their best they could with small material shifts, adjusting their expectations of warmth and their behaviours, but largely they just had to accept a cold, damp existence. These kinds of dynamics are likely to play out in cooling just as much as in heating. So from a policy intervention perspective, it's important to consider where, across multi-level cultures, the interventions need to occur. Once you've decided which groups to target, what is it that you're seeking to change? Don't immediately assume that material changes are the place to start. Consider changes in practices which cost little but make an appreciable difference. Or changes in people's expectations about indoor temperatures. For example, do offices and businesses need to be air-conditioned so cold? Or maybe changes to knowledge and skills, while being aware that simply providing information alone is very unlikely to result in cultural change across the other elements. It's also critical to be aware of the implications of any changes to cooling cultures. First of all, that interventions will probably have consequential changes for other aspects of culture that you'll need to look out for. Secondly, being aware of the different capacities that people have to change their cooling culture, because if not addressed, we could see increasingly inequitable impacts on people's health, well-being, and livelihoods. And finally, that changes to cooling cultures may have broader consequences than for the households or organisations who are trying to keep cool. For example, we could see a massive increase in peak demand on electricity systems over summer. Note, this is a very hypothetical line superimposed on New Zealand's summer demand. But are there policy interventions that mean we don't get this kind of response? From an engineering perspective, the automatic response would be, how do we increase supply to meet this demand? And that is very much an engineering culture, by the way. But are there policy interventions that mean that we don't get this kind of demand shift, such as solutions that can support less consumptive cooling or the potential for demand shifting? So to conclude, the key message I want to get across is that climate change will drive changes in what people have and use, what they do, how they think, and their knowledges, skills, and expressions. That is, it will drive changes to their cooling culture. So as we start to develop policy responses to a warming climate, it is important to look beyond a business as usual reaction of let's find technological solutions that will solve it for everyone, to a range of solutions that will have a better fit with different cooling cultures that we already have, and that will have better outcomes for health, well-being, and livelihoods, as well as for the resilience of our future energy supplies. I will leave you there with some references if anybody is interested. And again, my deep apologies for you not seeing those first half of my slides. I'm really sorry about that.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. Although we couldn't see the slides, it was informative anyway. Now I hand over to Russell for his presentation. Thank you. And after this, I will be asking some questions and then allow the public to ask them questions as well. Thank you.
Am I screen sharing?
Russell, we can see you. We can see your screen. Yeah.
How about that? Yep.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Antonella, and thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen to us and the invitation to speak to you guys about this really important topic too. So, like Janet, I also am of a view that culture should really be at the heart of the way in which we think about the challenge of reducing energy consumption through the global spread of air conditioning. If we think about it in the general sense, basically what we might see our task as being is one of encouraging different variation in cultures of relating to local climates, so safeguarding the variation that currently exists. Future. So if that's the case, we really need to understand how different local cultures develop in context, so we can engage, I guess, in a similar way to some of the things that Janet has discussed, with how they develop over time. So culture should be at the heart of this kind of discussion, I would argue. So even thinking about the very notion of an idea of need is, to my mind, a cultural product. So ideas about what people need in terms of their thermal environments have changed over time. We know that. They changed over place. And we need to think about that variation and how we engage with it as researchers. What I'm going to talk about in my discussion is how we go about doing that. So I'm interested particularly in ways of researching and understanding and engaging with an issue or an idea of culture in research. So I'm a qualitative researcher, and I'm interested in thinking about the ways in which we can use qualitative research techniques to say something useful, valuable about processes of engaging with cultural dynamics in terms of air conditioning practices. I'll be using a case study of a project I've done together with some colleagues in Qatar, using those methods to look at everyday life in air conditioning, to try and substantiate some of those claims. My point is that we could really benefit from using these kinds of techniques.
I'm afraid we're experiencing another technical issue with Russell's connection. Apologies, everyone. Let's wait another second, otherwise I'll move forward with asking some questions to Janet in the waiting. So Janet, while we wait for Russell to reconnect, your presentation was fantastic, it was really informative, and really I can't stop thinking about the tension between culture and transition, sustainable transition, because on one side we really want to preserve culture and sometimes traditions in one sense, and on the other side we are asking people to change completely the way that they think about cooling, or they think about thermal comfort. Okay, we have you back.
How much did you get of me?
It's okay. I mean, we are experiencing some technical issues today, no problem at all. So, Russell, we couldn't see, we only stopped at your first slide anyway. So I don't know if you were moving forward. So if that was also another technical issue, I don't know, but shall we start again? Oh,
yes. How much time have I got? I could just talk about things.
Okay, as you prefer. If that's easier, I'd rather, do that.
Yeah, it might be easier. Okay, so you heard what I was saying at the start about how like Janet and in her presentation, I think the culture is really fundamental to, or it can be a really kind of useful way into thinking about how we engage with international processes of change in everyday life and how air conditioning can be incorporated within those processes. In my works, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I do interviews. Sometimes I spend time with groups of people, and I try and use that exercise to uncover, understand how they relate to air conditioning in their everyday lives. Is one of the things I've done. And I was going to talk in my presentation about a particular project I did with some colleagues that looked at Qatar. So we did a study in which we compared how older Qatari nationals, younger Qatari nationals, and expatriate professionals related to the widespread provision of air conditioning in their everyday lives. So a really interesting case study. My broader contention I was going to develop through my slides is that we need to think quite hard about the ways in which we operationalize and engage with an idea of culture in this work. So there are different ways of thinking about culture. And my suggestion in the presentation, so this is ideas I'm working at the moment, is that we can benefit from trying to be as open-minded as possible in a way that qualitative research methods, so spending time with people, talking to them about their lives, they can be good at engaging with the specifics of how things work out in different contexts. So there's lots of recent research that's happened that has done useful, valuable work using qualitative techniques to look at how people relate to air conditioning all around the world. We've learned lots of different things about how people in different places might have some quite specific ways of thinking about what they need, what they want, how they should respond. So issues to do with clothing, issues to do with culture, issues to do with sweat, some of the things that Antonella mentioned at the start. But one of the concerns that I might have, or I do have, is the way in which culture can sometimes be squashed a little bit in our studies. So we try and use our studies to return to conceptual frameworks that we might already have, so particular theoretical accounts that we might think are useful to apply to the context we're trying to understand in our research. But sometimes that can stop us from really engaging as fully as we might with the detail and the specifics of how different local cultures are sustained and developed. Also, I think we can sometimes, and perhaps this is even more of a concern, we can sometimes downplay geographical variation when we're trying to make more general claims about the conclusions that we can draw from our studies. So sometimes we do studies in particular places around the world and we say, well, this is the way that sweat works. It's probably the same elsewhere. This is the way in which people relate to cold. Probably the same elsewhere. So that can sometimes be something that we do definitely in the cultural work. And yet, to go back to some of the ideas that we talked about at the start, obviously that's a problem. We want to kind of celebrate difference. We want to celebrate variation because that variation might very well be key to securing sustainable, potentially more enjoyable thermal features. Right? We don't want to drift towards a really dull experience of what plenty of people would call thermal monotony, in which buildings promise comfort but actually present us with like dull, uninteresting, and at the same time highly energy consumptive thermal environments. So that's the kind of idea that I was going to develop in my paper. Qatar is a great case study for looking at these kinds of things. I'm not going to say it would be as easy to emphasize these things looking in a different cultural context about these matters because things have changed so fast in Qatar. So it's often held up as a concerning place in terms of the extent to which people in Doha have come to rely on air conditioning cultures. And in our study, I would suggest that by virtue of taking a really open-ended approach, by virtue of not squashing culture, we can come up with some even better, potentially more effective, more original suggestions about how local cultures might be encouraged to evolve. So it's partly an issue to do with research practice, the way in which we think about our studies and how they work. It's partly about how we engage with different cultural sites. So in our study, to give you a bit of a snapshot of what came out of it before I wrap up, and it's quite quick, I guess. So one of the things that we found in our study, one of the things that we concluded in the study, so as I said, we did loads of interviews, either myself or one of our field assistants, with older Qatari nationals, younger Qatari nationals, and expatriate professionals that lived there for a while, and we talked in a really open-ended way about the ways in which they might relate to air conditioning. So we didn't prescribe those conversations in terms of, for example, doing what many people would do, and what people sometimes quite often do in the wider discussion around air conditioning, which is to demarcate the discussion around a notion of thermal comfort. So it's about more than thermal comfort. I think it's potentially much more productive to think in an open-ended way about how people relate to air conditioning. So we could have talked to people about whether they were hot or too cold in different contexts, and we did, but it was about more than that. And we ended up focusing quite a lot on the ways in which different groups thought about other groups in terms of their thermal needs. So individually speaking, particular groups often thought that actually we're too cold. So that must mean that for other groups, it's cold for them. So they buy into a suggestion that the cold environments they're often provided with in offices, in shopping malls, generally speaking, in the context of everyday life there, it was often quite highly air conditioned. An idea that circulated within particular groups about how the cold was probably provided for other groups, because if we're cold and it's there, then it must be provided for somebody else. Right? That was one of the ideas that we tried to explore in the study. And then as part of that, we started to develop an idea of why it was that particular conditioning conversations, this is an idea that we came up with to some extent, were being squeezed out of the public discussion. So why weren't, if this was the case, if it was the case that plenty of people were feeling quite cold, why weren't people talking to each other about it? And there were issues there to do with how it was recognized that the local climate was particularly harsh, hostile. Yes, it was incredibly hot there in summer, and it would be very difficult to deal with those conditions without the supply of things like air conditioning. But that kind of idea of the summer being a difficult time would then translate into how people felt about time indoors. So it was a harsh climate, and that meant harsh, hot summer conditions outside. But also meant an idea of adapting to particularly cold conditions indoors. So this is a harsh place, and we should therefore adapt to the cold, just as we should adapt to the heat, even though obviously it's quite possible that you could vary the supply of cold, so it wasn't something that was out of people's control. So broadly speaking, one of the ideas that I want to emphasize, I suppose, from that study is the value of taking an open-ended approach that doesn't squash culture, that doesn't kind of force it into particular frameworks, and doesn't downplay geographical specificity in pursuit of broader claims from our individual studies, because doing so can allow us to really attend to, give us a chance to let the context that we're researching really breathe and to show us the details of how they work in ways that could help us to identify valuable interventions. In this case, the conclusion was, and we had no idea this is something we might conclude at the start, that it could be really useful to try and stage a more broader public conversation about different thermal expectations, to the extent to which people might or might not need air conditioning in context of their lives, what air conditioning was doing to their culture, so people could actively reflect in often really interesting and valuable ways about what air conditioning was doing for the nature of the family, what air conditioning was doing to people's personalities. All of that kind of stuff is the kind of material that you might not get access to if you define your research questions perhaps in terms of thermal comfort, or if you focus in a particular way, perhaps through a survey that defines the ways in which people might relate to your topic. All that kind of stuff gets lost. But if we're going to really go to town in terms of running with an argument about the importance of culture, then we need to adopt techniques that allow us to really engage with culture. Qualitative methods can do that, and they allow us to identify lots of different ideas that we could then use to, I guess, challenge as much as reproduce existing frameworks for thinking about the topic that we might have already. So really putting culture as an idea through its paces could be something that could be really helpful here in this context, because fundamentally speaking, what we're trying to do, as I said at the start, is to safeguard and often encourage geographical diversity in terms of how people handle their local climates, which is absolutely a question of how cultures become established and evolve in particular geographical contexts. There you go, I winged it without any slides.
You were right on time. Thank you so much. And it was very nice also without the slides, without the visual input. Absolutely perfect. Thank you so much, Russell, for this presentation, for your reflections on the methods, on how to understand thermal comfort and to frame the right research questions. I have a couple of questions for both of you, and I think that they're all quite similar in the sense that we all know that the term culture is very slippery, and we are navigating through times that we are basically putting everything on a global level, right? So we are, when policies are made at the global level, you annihilate all the specificities of different cultures, of course. So how do we negotiate that tension between the richness of local culture? What should we keep? What should we discard? And what should we promote as a message, or multiple messages at the global level? So that's a question to you both. Janet, do you want to start?
Goodness. Well, I mean, to my way of thinking, and this is from I suppose, a South Pacific perspective, from a small island in the middle of nowhere, I think that we are certainly thinking globally about climate change and about cooling responses and every other sort of adaptation response and mitigation response simultaneously. How are we going to solve this problem? But for each country, we are also thinking very specifically about what is it about our country that what changes can we afford to make, what changes are going to be acceptable within our cultural milieu, what changes are relevant to our particular resources and the particular impacts of climate change. So I think becoming increasingly specific about what are the possibilities within this culture that we have in this country, or the multiple cultures that we have within this country, to assist us in this journey is where I think a lot of where the rubber hits the road, because you can make all of the global policy promises that you like, but it's not until each individual, each family, each business has made those changes that we can say that we're on the path to a sustainable future. So the more that we can use understandings of the way people behave as forms of collectives, which is really what culture is all about, how the conversations and the way we interact and the way we're brought up and the way that we engage with others influences our behaviour, and how we can collectively think about how those influences might shift and change and reproduce in different ways and create different cultures that are either good or bad for sustainability and for equity and so forth. Those are the critical questions when it comes to the application of these ideas.
Yeah, for my part, I'm not going to say much that's too different to that, other than to really emphasize thinking really carefully and thinking really hard about how we deal with an idea of global in our research. So it can be really tempting when we're really aware of, as you guys are, the global challenge of tackling this topic, to try and reach for claims, statements about what we do as a global collective. But if you really want to take culture seriously, many of the suggestions that might come from our studies, we should recognize, should be thought of as place specific, as kind of specific to that culture group. So if we study a group, it can be really tempting to say, okay, I've learned something really useful here that probably applies elsewhere. Let's go for it, guys. Let's tackle global climate change by looking at this idea all across the world. But if we really run with the cultural idea fully, then actually perhaps plenty of our conclusions, we should be targeting local policymakers. We should be thinking about the local context. We should be perhaps embedding ourselves in particular contexts over a longer period of time, so we can really build up those links and develop our relationships with those local actors, because chances are maybe things could be very different somewhere else, and the suggestions that might be right for another place might not be the same ones as the ones we've developed for the place that we've studied.
Mm. And a nice little example of that is one of my PhD students is Tongan, and he's studying energy cultures in Tonga. Nearly finished, so I can talk about this a little. But essentially, what he was interested in is why policies for energy efficiency and other energy interventions are just not working. And it's obvious once you start looking at the very specificities of culture and in its broadest sense in a place like Tonga, it's clear why an imported policy from Australia or New Zealand is just not going to work, because it is working on quite a different cultural context. And it's that kind of specific application, I think, that both Russell and I are agreeing on is the critical thing.
I'm going to add another layer of difficulty to this topic, and is about peer influence and the rating system and the star system that we find everywhere. Like when you leave a rating, right? So on other platform I can't mention right now, but like peer influence is something real. And if someone is very happy about a specific air conditioner or a specific brand, etc., and is getting influenced by some other cultures through media and through access to international platforms, etc., that creates a tension with the previous culture that was there before. So the intergenerational, knowledge that was there before. So even in a house, it creates some tension between like the international pressure and the pressure of the past knowledge and the previous culture. So understanding what people really want from a particular culture is particularly difficult today, right? And how do we solve this issue? How do we move towards a sustainable future with that? Because we take into consideration the tensions between different inputs. Right?
Shall I say something? Okay, so on that one, yeah, there were lots in that question, but to me, these are all kind of things waiting to be explored, right? Rather than stuff that we can say this is the answer to. That's basically the argument throughout my whole talk. But the idea of different cultures in tension is a really interesting one. So rather than, I mean, the other way of looking at what you were describing would just say a culture would evolve, rather than, we've got the young culture and the older culture. The extent to which people think about themselves as having different cultures or not, in particular contexts we might want to influence, is an empirical question to me. And looking at those ideas in practice could give us some really useful ideas about how we can deal with different groups in different contexts. The other idea that I quite liked was to, in what you were saying, was to think about really run with an idea of peer influence, but run with it in a more general sense, rather than just to think of it around. So you're talking about energy certification and how perhaps people might get certain ideas of status or being the right kind of person through buying particular technologies. Well, if peer influence is important, then there's lots of ways in which peer influence might kick in ways that might have implications for energy consumptive aircon. So for us, so going back to our Qatari case, peer influence in terms of the status that might become attached to feeling modern and feeling like a particular generation might have particular thermal needs, might need it to be colder, was really perhaps much more significant than that kind of sustainability peer influence. So I would say peer influence is really cool as a topic, but let's not, let's think about the connections between peer influence around doing sustainable things and peer influence more generally in broader cultural context, because that might give us a fuller picture of how peer influence kicks in. That's my response.
No, absolutely. So the idea of modernity should be attached to something that is not precisely just related to energy consuming equipment or the latest shining, technology, but it can be reshaped by other forces that define or help shaping the term modernity towards a lower energy consuming technologies, or maybe even looking at vernacular solutions, etc. Right? That's the challenge. So from multiple institutions. I also wanted to point out, like you Russell mentioned, the value of qualitative research to unpack these specificities. Of course, there are several techniques that can be used, and I understand that in terms of time framing, a lot of people rely on interview or questionnaires, etc. But a deeper understanding of culture requires time, which enter in contrast with the fast culture of policy, right? So again, how can we negotiate that tension? How can we grasp the best possible substance of the policy?
Shall I start? Yeah, I mean, I'm a qualitative researcher myself. That's where I'm most comfortable. But I have worked a great deal with colleagues who are quantitatively expert. and I have a great deal of respect for the potential for quantitative methods to also give us insights into culture. And in particular, the way we used it in the Energy Cultures program was to use a number of ideas about, and I must say there, because we always look at culture in relation to a particular outcome we're interested in. So we're saying, what are the cultural influences that are driving this sustainability related outcome? In this instance, we were interested in energy efficiency of households. And so we undertook a national survey of around 2,000 households, asked them a whole lot of questions about aspects of culture. And then my wonderful colleagues then carried out a cluster analysis and were able to identify clusters of households across the country, which basically fell into 4 different patterns that had quite significantly or similar and quite distinctive set of cultural attributes that were leading to particular outcomes in terms of energy efficiency. So those kinds of quantitative methods can be really helpful, but either to look at how different cultures are spread across a population, or potentially, I suppose, methods that can be used to look at specific relationships between, for example, people's expectations and their desire to purchase goods and services. So kind of from more of an economic perspective, you could use, we have used a number of quantitative methods there as well. But to do that sort of fundamental, can I start with a ground zero to try and understand this culture? There's nothing like qualitative methods to do that. I hand over to Russell at that point.
Very true. I mean, that's essentially my point. I wouldn't want what I said to be interpreted as qualitative methods as the only way to go. I'd rather say that I'd love, what they are really good at doing, as Janet says, is allowing us to open up our eyes to the ways in which hitherto unknown combinations of factors might kick into local cultural context. So it would be really, I would love it if, these are not the skills that I might have as much as somebody else might have, but I would love it if somebody used some of the ideas that we came up with in our Qatari study to do a survey on the extent to which people, felt that air conditioning was provided to because of other people's needs, perhaps, rather than their own. So you can see how qualitative work can be really helpful here in terms of it allows us to think quite creatively about the ways in which we might deploy other research strategies, right? So it's quite common that people do lots of survey work on what's comfortable or not. There's lots of kind of quantitative work there around air conditioning that starts with comfort. But could we do survey work that starts with social expectation? Could we do survey work that starts with kind of like a thermal hospitality, right? An idea of kind of providing it to particular groups for particular reasons? So there's absolutely no reason why these kinds of approaches couldn't inform quantitative studies that perhaps might be more amenable to your policymaker guys. You hinted at how we inform policy. One of the challenges there is kind of like sample sizes is important for those guys in terms of feeling confident to make decisions based on the results of our projects. Then that could be one way to go. So that's what I would say in terms of those kinds of issues.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you both. So I might ask the public to post their questions at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And if you have any questions to our panelists, please post it here.
There are already some questions here.
I can see Peter, right? It would be interesting to hear panelists' thoughts on why people in cold countries tend to keep their houses, offices, shops much warmer than in more temperate countries. This is a very interesting question. Thank you, Peter.
Wow.
Can I speak? I might speak from experience here. Yeah, I suppose New Zealand is on the cusp of being a very cold country and a temperate country, and we have particularly poor housing quality, and so We do tend to live in cold houses. When we have people from Europe come to stay in New Zealand, people are always complaining about how cold the houses are, how uncomfortable they feel. And it has become very much a cultural norm here to just cope, just put up with it. Probably over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a very strong policy push to try and improve housing insulation, which has gone a little way to solve this, but nothing like the investment in central heating that most colder countries have. And I think that's the big difference, is that in a sense, once you have a central heating system, and I'm speaking from our own experience here in cold Dunedin, we have put one in, you tend to put it on and leave it on and become accustomed to a warmer house, and that becomes completely normalized. So all of those aspects of energy culture that I was talking about before, I can see playing out very much in our own lives. So I think it's partly infrastructure and partly normative positioning. But over to you, Russell.
Yeah, thanks for a bit of extra time to think about it. So I mean, yes. So the traditional way of thinking about it, I think, in Europe at least, is the kind of like there's a kind of threshold type of thing. So kind of when you go to certain colder countries, then people are much more aware of the importance of insulation. They provide more insulation, and then they have more insulation. So Britain, for example, is not particularly good in those terms, because it's kind of, it gets cold, but it hasn't got sufficiently cold to make us think harder about how we invest more fully in the insulation that will make sure we're nice and warm during the winter months. So it's kind of, you can think about it in terms of those issues. So it might be interesting to think in terms of kind of thresholds, perhaps, I suppose. But I guess also, I mean, to link to the cultural stuff. So, I mean, the obvious idea that it makes me think of, and there's some really interesting work on kind of is it huggy? I can never quite say the word. The Scandinavian notion of coziness, and how that, so you can see here, I mean, it is just as much a cultural question as a technical question. So how people in particular contexts around the world come to, embrace and have it as very much part of the way in which they see themselves, how they should keep themselves super warm, or sufficiently warm in the winter months. So it's partly an issue of how different countries respond to different climates, but it's also just at the same time, as it always is, a cultural issue to do with how particular ideas, norms and practices get established too.
Thank you both. We have another question, a couple of questions actually. So Jared says, thank you both for excellent presentations. I was interested in hearing more about your thoughts on landlord-controlled cooling systems, who I imagine are responsible for a basic level of heating, even if the tenant does not pay the heating bill. In your opinion, is there any advantages of having a centrally controlled system, because then the choice of keeping the dwelling at unhealthy levels, especially a lack of heat due to poverty or a desire to save money, is taken out of the renter's hand? Thank you, Jared, for your question.
Yeah, issues more autonomy in terms of kind of, I mean, they definitely come to the fore in terms of domestic heating and cooling, and in fact, Anton and I were listening to a really interesting presentation on tenancy arrangements in Australia and how different landlords and tenants might have different ways of speaking about heat risk that might perhaps be partly connected to what's in their own self-interest. So I guess I'm doing what the kind of research I do always does at this point, is to kind of like flip the question and to think about how cultural factors might kick in to the process. So I think there's definitely some interesting ideas in there. I don't want to come out and make a stand on how they think how it works and how it should work, because, well, as I said in my talk, for me it's always a kind of an object of research. I want to go and spend time with different relevant groups. I want to kind of like maybe speak to different landlords about how they think about what their tenants might need, like to look at how they negotiate tensions between them around heating, and then see where that takes me. So yeah, I'm not inclined to make a big broad statement on that one, but there's some interesting and definitely cultural issues at play, I would imagine.
I would agree. I think in New Zealand, for the most part, we don't have landlord-supplied heating systems, though I have seen some come in. We're in a student city here, and some of the more modern development certainly have that supplied, but it is quite unusual in New Zealand to have that. Other work we've done looking at energy cultures in New Zealand in particular does indicate that independence is a really strong cultural feature in New Zealanders. We like to be in control of our own lives, and that plays out in lots of interesting ways in other aspects of energy use. And I can only make a supposition that generally, I think New Zealanders would be happier to be able to control their own heating systems rather than have it controlled by a landlord, partly because just of that personal sense of having your own ability to make your own decisions, but also because they would be concerned about cost. And if they were charged a flat rate and they felt the place was too hot, they would feel that they were being heated by their landlords, probably. So yeah, but I know I've lived at times in different Scandinavian countries, and there the heating is just on 24/7, and I get so hot I have to force the windows open to try and keep it cool. So again, more cultural expectations being blown out of the water.
Yeah. So we have only 1 minute to answer the last question, and if you're ready, do you know of any services perhaps initiated by businesses or government programs that are applying this contextualized, culturally aware approach to cooling, thermal comfort in practice in homes, communities, or supply chains? Thank you, Gemma, for asking this question.
I can say that when we finished the Energy Cultures Research Program in 2016, we put together an extensive series of policy briefs, which we presented to government, and they were very well received. And I have seen that some of the recommendations appear to have been picked up, but whether it was because we recommended them in the policy briefs or because they came through another direction, I have no idea. But I can say that the kind of analysis that one can offer through a cultural lens actually can come up with some very specific and I think quite useful recommendations for direct policy interventions or policy changes. And so this isn't soft waffle that doesn't mean anything. It can end up with some really useful, very crisp policy recommendations that can be put in place by governments.
Yeah, for me, it's the idea is kind of make me nervous about the idea of rolling out a framework, because cultural variation is always already there to some extent. So different policies in different places would be evidence of people engaging with culture in exactly this kind of way. So perhaps I would rather think of what I'm doing as about engaging with, exploring with, perhaps kind of pushing and influencing the development of those cultural processes as they go along, rather than kind of rolling out a framework to get people to think in this way. Because often, as much us who are not thinking in this way as much as those people we might want to influence. So plenty of people might be already very well aware of how culture is super important. So I wouldn't want to say I'm going to tell them about that. I'm going to rather say I want to learn from them about how that works for them and see how I could be helpful in influencing that process as things move forward into the future.
That's great, brilliant answer. Thank you both. Well, we need to wrap up now, and thank you so much for having this fantastic debate on the importance of social interactions and cooling and cultures for cooling. As we mentioned earlier, the debate has been dominated by technocentric perspectives. So while I see that many people already see the importance of cooling, it's important that we reinforce the importance of culture for cooling. We need to reinforce this view as well, for a diversity of perspectives on cooling, which are all valuable, of course. So I hope that this debate helped everyone to gather the complexity of understanding cultures for sustainable cooling. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the public. Thank you, Gemma, for organizing this, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And see you next time, next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.